Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and so today we're just going to do a video about my idea for how I would have dealt with the chipset cooling on motherboards where you can't just use the VRM heatsink for it. So what do I mean by that? Well, basically with there's only one X570 motherboard that's completely passive, and that's the X570 Extreme. And the way the Extreme does that is basically they have the chipset and they have this massive fin stack over here above the SoC VRM, and they run a heat pipe from the chipset to that fin stack, and that's basically it. The reason why this works is that the VRM under that fin stack is so efficient that it doesn't really make use of all of that surface area. So instead, Gigabyte is using that surface area to cool the chipset. And the thing is that got me thinking, well, if you just got a little bit creative with you could take a fin stack like that and just put it somewhere else on the motherboard, right? Because on a lot of motherboards, you can't do this because the VRM itself gets too hot under certain loading conditions for this to work. And so, yeah, and basically my idea is, the thing is, I think like a lot of people might be like, oh, but X570 is only like 11 to 15 watts, right? We used to have north bridges on motherboards, which a north bridge could easily be as much as 30 watts, and it would live right down the center of the motherboard, and those would often be passive. But the thing about north bridges is that, yeah, they live down the center of the motherboard, where these days we normally have an M.2 slot, right? So that's basically why you can't do that anymore, because it's just like, yeah, you're going to put your fin stack where the M.2 lives, and you'd basically have to relay out the board completely. Now, with the Extreme, it's not really worth looking at that board too much, but if we go onto something like the Pro Wi-Fi, right, and we look at our board, so we can't use the VRM heatsink because, I wish I could draw on this, but unfortunately, like the one app that I have for like freestyle drawing anywhere for Windows is awful. Like it's really, really bad, so I can't really use it. But so you can't use the CPU, like the VRM heatsink here, because this VRM does actually need to make use of its own VRM heatsink, so you can't just stick the chipset's heat output into that. Now, you also can't put a massive heatsink where the chipset itself is, because it has to live under a bunch of GPUs potentially, right? Somebody installs two GPUs into this and they're 270 millimeters long. That GPU is ending at the edge of the motherboard. You can't put a tall chipset heatsink. It won't work with the GPU. Also, the exhaust from the GPU might be kind of less than ideal for cooling a chipset. So that's also another issue that you run into. However, there is a space on the motherboard that doesn't inherently do anything, and that's this area right here, right? Between the 24 pin and basically this screw hole. Now, a lot of the time we just see like fan headers being put in this area, right? That kind of thing. But do notice how like this board has plenty of space up here or plenty of space down here, which I assume is for SATA port options on some of their other motherboard models. We have plenty of space. Like fan headers, I feel like you don't have to put them on this in this area, right? So my solution to because basically, right, if we just get a fin stack that's roughly the same size as the fin stack on the Extreme, and we just stick it somewhere else on the motherboard, we can deal with the chipset's heat output, right? That's basically what you need to do. So my idea is just put the chipset heatsink right here. Basically run a heat pipe from the chipset heatsink to here, and then have it stick straight up out of the motherboard. Why would I have it stick straight up? Well, as soon as it sticks up, right, we get something like this. And basically, it clears all of the GPUs, right? So you can have it clear all of the PCIe slots, no problem, like that, right? You can have, and unfortunately, I suck at SketchUp, so I barely know the controls for this, so yeah, this model is not to scale even remotely. I'm kind of realizing that this fin stack has a bit too much space, but you could do a lot of things, like maybe have the fin stack start further up so that it can actually go over the edge of a ATX motherboard a little bit, right? Depending on the case. Well, actually, no. Yeah, you can totally do that, because there's normally space for a 24 pin in this area, right? So there wouldn't be any issue with the fin stack being a little bit taller and actually being, say, like, if we just add a line to that, right? Because basically we need to squeeze as much surface area into this area as possible. So then you could just basically do something like this, where you know, you still have like this will clear almost any case. Technically, the motherboard's not ATX anymore because it's a little bit too wide now. But this should have no clearance. Like for most cases, this shouldn't cause any real clearance issues, right? Because like there are cases with recessed motherboard trays. That's the concern I'm dealing with by doing this sort of notch here. But yeah, if you have the recessed motherboard tray, well, this is going to go over any recess. Like, you can just start the fin stack high enough, like, start up the wider part of the fin stack high enough that doesn't matter. The other benefit that having the fin stack right here instead of, like, in that area or anywhere else on the motherboard has is that this is, like, in most cases, you're just going to have front intake right in this area, right? So you're going to get fresh air smashing, like, basically the chipset is going to be the very first thing that gets cooled in the entire system if you run a front air intake setup, right? Which basically means like it should run really cool. It should actually run even cooler than what you get on the extreme with the chipset heatsink being, you know, the SoC VRM heatsink, which is generally in an area of the motherboard that just doesn't get much airflow because you have memory slots, CPU coolers, you know, just there's a panel up top above that. Like this area of the board is kind of airflow restrictive. This area, however, especially if you have front air intake, like this is just going to have fresh air. This is probably the coolest area of your case. So cooling the chipset right here would be very easy. Now, potential concerns is that with this is that you're going to have heat from the chipset hitting the memory, so the memory might get a little bit warm. You might have to, some motherboards might potentially need to like shift the 24 pin closer to the top edge of the board rather than, you know, lower. The heat pipe might be a bit awkward to lay out around, say, fan connectors or that kind of thing. But overall, I think this would work. Like, I really think this would work for the height limit. Like, the thing is, you could also just make this skinnier and much, much taller, right? That's always also an option because most people are going to use a GPU, and we all know how tall a GPU is relative to the rest of the motherboard. Like, I have this scaled against like relatively tall heat spreader memory sticks, but if we scaled this against like a GPU, a GPU, we could have this almost probably like twice as tall as it is. Like it could end up. Wait, can I actually? It's not going to let me do that. Oh no, yeah, you could have it like this tall probably, right? So you'd have a massive fin stack. Depending on just how much, how the board's laid out, what kind of case compatibility you're aiming for, right? And it, honestly, like, you know, for maybe it isn't the best idea for a motherboard to ship with this, but as an aftermarket, like, I would potentially see this as a reasonable accessory to offer for your motherboard series, especially if all of the motherboards from a certain vendor use the exact same mounting, like, well, roughly similar layouts for the chipset heatsink mounting holes, and then how the rest of the motherboard is laid out around that, you could totally have like an accessory that's basically just this, right? Like it's literally just a chip alternative heatsink that you could buy to upgrade your motherboard with that would make your chipset passive. And I think that would be really, really cool in more ways than one, right? Oops. But yeah, so this is basically just my idea, and I'm just surprised that we haven't seen a motherboard do anything like this, because there's actually, like on an EATX motherboard, this actually works even better because you have more space in this general area of the board, but this right here, I'm thinking like even on an ATX board, you could fit this, right? Because that's the whole thing, is just like on motherboards you're limited in terms of like horizontal space quite heavily, because you have, you know, you have SATA ports, PCIe slots, M.2 slots, memory slots, CPU sockets, VRMs, like you have all kinds of connectors that need to live on the surface of the motherboard. But if you go up, right, if you just build your heatsink upwards instead of horizontally, then you're kind of not restricted too much by dimensions. Though I guess packaging this in a box is also going to be awkward. Like if a board shipped with this, can you imagine what the, like, you'd have to have the heatsink as a separate accessory in the box. It would have to come, like the motherboard would have to come without the heatsink installed, because this would not fit in most boxes. But yeah, so there are some practical concerns with this, but I think it would be a really elegant solution to the whole issue of having a chipset fan. Because on a lot of motherboards, the main issue is like you just can't get enough surface area under the GPUs that'll reliably cool the chipset. You can't run a heat pipe to the VRM because the VRM is too hot to you can't borrow thermal capacity from the VRM because it already doesn't necessarily have it, just like it barely has enough as is. And yeah, so you basically need a dedicated fin stack for the chipset, and this is probably the best place to put it in, as far as I'm concerned, at least. So yeah, and the fins would basically go horizontally. So like from like if you had fins in that, they'd be like this, or oops, like that. You'd have the fins like that in the heatsink. And why? Because that's just how they'd be easiest to mount to the heat pipe. That's really that simple. Also, it wouldn't necessarily need a super high fin density, because really high fin densities actually don't work that well in passive airflow conditions. Like if you don't have a lot of air pressure, which you don't have after you're, several, like after a good amount of distance away from a fan, you're just not going to have a lot of air pressure to smash the air into a really dense fin stack. So with this, it would be a good idea to go for a relatively low fin density for it to work properly. But that's basically details. The general idea is just like put the chipset fin stack here, because that is the only area of a motherboard where it's just like you're not necessarily going to have a lot of stuff there, right? That gets in the way. Because again, if we look at real motherboards, right, like M.2 slots, M.2 slots, rear, like front, just all kinds of I/O down here. And then like the only thing on this board that's in the way is this USB port and the fan headers. And there's a bunch of empty space right here. So, you could shift that around a bit. Or you could put actually, if you had right angle fan headers, then it's not an issue as well, right? Right angle fan header is not an issue. This capacitor is a clearance problem, and then that USB port. But those are like the only two things you'd have to move if you put right angle fan headers, which you can mark it as a feature, I guess, because it's like, oh, right angle connectors are a new feature for a lot of motherboards to show off about. You could also shift the 24 pin upwards, and then you could totally clear that heatsink. Now, let's take a look at some MSI boards, which I think are actually more viable for this. Yeah, they are. So if we look at like this board, there's basically nothing here, right? Like there's basically like there's this one capacitor. If that capacitor was in a slightly different location, you can put a fin stack right there, and you'd maybe want to shift the 24 pin up a bit as well. But actually, you could potentially try squeeze the fin stack into like sort of like if you got creative with the shape of the fins as well, you could actually have the fin stack. Like you could have the heat pipe end right between this MOSFET and that inductor, right? Here the heat pipe would start going up, and then you could have a fin stack that kind of just like is a bit of an S shape around all of that, so that you can actually use this area, because you don't have like the GPU's down here, right? So you still have a gap between like the DIMM slots and the GPU, though actually removing memory sticks might be kind of awkward if that heatsink was there. So okay, that might not work out that well, but you could have the heatsink go over the SATA ports a little bit. Like over this one, you could go a little bit over it, because again the GPU is just like that's basically centered on that SATA port. So yeah, here you'd still have some space. Like you'd certainly be able to cram a lot more surface area than anything you'd be able to fit under here, even if it was just even if the fins were barely larger than the heat pipe itself, right? Let's say you have a 6mm diameter heat pipe, you could maybe have, I don't know, 12mm diameter fins on that heat pipe, and they'd be circular. Like it would still be way more surface area than what you can fit right here. And if you had the fins get steadily larger as you go up that heat pipe, you could get, you could get even more surface area on there. But at that point, it might be a little bit too elaborate to manufacture and rather expensive, but still. So on that board, you could do that. On the Gaming Pro Carbon, yeah, this one's ATX, right? Yeah, that's an ATX board. Basically, yeah, this one's basically the same layout. We arguably, again, have just enough space, again, for the same idea to work. This only has 4 SATA ports. Oh, no, there's 2 more down there. So, yeah, on there it would work. The A Pro, the Gaming Plus, and the Edge Wi-Fi actually all use the same exact layout. So there, if it worked on the Gaming Plus, it would work on all 3 of those. Ace... I think this one's kind of the worst. Yeah, this one's the worst because the 24 pin, for some inexplicable reason, is shifted way down. And I wanted the gallery. So yeah, on this board, you'd probably have to like squeeze the fin, like this fan connector would have to be like a right angled, and the fin stack would have to squeeze into this area. But again, it's a heat pipe. Like MSI is running a heat pipe all the way up here, but you could just run a heat pipe instead into this area. Right, you can't put a heat sink in this area of the motherboard because obviously like CPU socket clearance issues. And again, M.2 slot right there. And Well, no, heatsink, like basically anywhere in this area, you're just CPU heatsink clearance issues, right? You can't really put a big, tall vertical fin stack in that area. But you could totally stick one on this edge of the motherboard. Like there's nothing here normally, right? It's just a bunch of fan connectors and you can put those at right angles. And then it's just like, because the thing about right angle 24 pins is they're actually quite bulky in terms of board space. So those would actually make things worse and not better for my idea. So yeah, you basically have to fit the fin stack up in this area. So this board would need a significantly different location for the fin stack, but it could still be a workable solution to the whole getting the chipset passive, right? I guess also you'd need to add like a screw, like some kind of support mechanism for that fin stack. So you'd need like a screw hole somewhere in this area to hold the fin stack in place, because that's also another concern, is like structural integrity is an issue. The Pro, we already talked about it. Just make the like that USB Type C connector is an issue, or no, that whatever that USB connector. I don't remember. Like I can't keep track of the silly names that USB keeps coming up with. So whatever that connector is basically the main issue here. Then the fan headers. Let's see, UD. Let's check this board out. Oh, Gigabyte's website is being slow for some reason. Oh no, it's fine anyway. But I want that back on the motherboard page. So if we look at this, oh, see, this board's perfect for it. There's just a MOSFET and an inductor in this area. So bam, smash a fin stack right there. Potentially maybe shift the 24 pin over. Actually, the other thing is, if we go back into SketchUp, right, we can actually do, because the 24 pin sticks up a certain amount out of the board. But if we make the fin stack like silly tall, where's the push thing? There we go. Bam. So if we make the fin stack silly tall, right, we can potentially go and pencil. We can put like a division up here, and then bam, more surface area. At this point, it's getting kind of ridiculous, and you'd have to have a heat pipe that basically goes something like, that basically goes something like this through the fin stack. But it would totally be a workable solution, in my opinion. Like, it would be an option. Not necessarily the best option, but here I'm working around motherboards that weren't designed with this kind of heatsink idea at all, right? Like, I'm trying to fit this idea onto boards that are already finished and aren't really optimal. Like, if you started a motherboard from zero with the intention to put a fin stack right in this area, it would be very easy to accommodate. So yeah, because it's like this board's a perfect example. There's just not really anything there, and you could just shift the 24 pin up a bit and you'd be sorted. So yeah, wait, X570 boards, what else is there? Oh, let's see. No, not the Ultra. That's just a Pro. Like, this uses the same layout as the Pro Wi-Fi because it's basically the same PCB. Gaming X is, I think, the same PCB as the UD board. Where's the master? Why am I not? There's the master. So here we have the master, and yeah, this actually runs into the same issue as the Pro, right? Like, if we look at this, fan headers, lean the fan headers over, move that capacitor, move that connector, bam, you can put a fin stack right here, right? Or, actually, you could well, no, that screw hole right there is an issue. That cap, like, if that cap wasn't where it is, you could totally squeeze a fin stack, like, you could squeeze a heat pipe above the fan headers, and then have it grow, bend it up and start the fins higher up that heat pipe than normal, and you could just cram a bunch of surface area into that area as well. And again, it's like the main benefit this has is that you're getting fresh air from the front intake of most cases. Like, this would run really cool in most people's case configurations, with all like I'm making a lot of assumptions here, like, but I'm just surprised because the thing is, I saw engineering sample motherboards from Gigabyte with passive X570 heatsinks. And basically I was told, yeah, the issue with these is they don't pass thermal testing. And I'm like, well, y'all, like, like, I feel like they went with a really conventional heatsink layout. And it's like, well, yeah, that doesn't work because your VRM runs too hot. The chipset is in an awkward location to cool. And the only, the Extreme gets away with it because that VRM is so damn efficient. But a lot of the other boards, it doesn't work because, you run into all kinds of, like, you just run into the issue of that VRM heatsink has to deal with the VRM first, not the chipset. But yeah, if you just like this area of the motherboard, in my opinion, like here as well, if you just make those freaking fan headers right angled and then move that cap, like you just have to move that capacitor. That's it. Honestly, this is a modification. Like depending, yeah, actually, I could probably modify this motherboard to be compatible with that heatsink idea. Like you would just desolder that capacitor and then replace it with an SMD capacitor, which SMD capacitors are expensive. So I understand why board vendors don't like using them. They are rather expensive, but you could replace that capacitor with an SMD capacitor and bam, you have enough space for the heat pipe to get through. Because the main issue is just like right now you'd have to squeeze the heat pipe between that cap and that screw hole, and that's just not going to happen. Yeah, and then you wouldn't even have to worry about that USB connector, right? And you could have a fin stack that basically occupies the empty space between the fan headers and the like up until this area of the 24 pin. And the heat pipe would start around start curving up around this start curving up around this area, and it would center out here. And yeah. So anyway, that's just my idea for cooling the. Actually, we haven't looked at Asus boards, so let's try adapt that idea to Asus boards, because I want to just like the thing is, I think this idea is just like somebody should have come up with this. Which board? Let's go with the Pro, because this is like the generic Asus layout. So, okay, well, Asus decided to do like, yeah, okay, on Asus boards, this is this board, it works the least. Because this side of their motherboard is actually really crowded. They could have probably shifted the 24 pin up. So yeah, on these boards, okay, yeah, that's just not going to fit on this. Yeah. So on this, it doesn't work at all because there's just not enough space. Like there's that USB connector, and you'd have to basically you'd have to rearrange this entire side of the board. And also for whatever reason, they seem to have the CPU socket like really far from the rear I/O compared to some of these boards. Like the distance from this edge of the CPU socket to the edge of the motherboard, I feel like is shorter on this board than on the other boards, even though this is like an AT, because yeah, that aligns with that screw hole. Yeah, they are. They've basically, like Asus basically shifted their, like relative to say the Gigabyte or the, see, an MSI board. Yeah, relative to the Gigabyte or MSI boards, Asus has basically shifted their CPU socket and all of their memory slots as a result as well, a couple millimeters to the edge of the motherboard. So yeah, on this board, you're not going to fit it. And as a result, I don't think you're going to fit it on any of the other X570 Asus boards. Like my idea, it wouldn't fit because the boards are just laid out wrong for it. But yeah, and I'm not ripping, like, you know, like I'm not trying to be ripping on Asus. Honestly, I think it's like somebody like, you know, it's just a silly idea. It might just be a really silly idea that I have, but it's just like if the extreme, right? Where is it? Damn it, that's not the extreme. That's also not an oh, there was the extreme. Undo close there. Right. If this heat, like you just need to get a similar amount of surface area in the, like somewhere else on the motherboard, and then connect a heat pipe to it from the chipset. That's basically the whole idea that I have here. And that would solve your chipset cooling issues, because that's how this board solves the chipset cooling issues, right? And actually, if you have a short, like the other thing is, if you have a shorter heat pipe, right, going right here, you'd actually have the heat transfer would be more effective. So yeah, anyway, so that's my idea for trying to get the chipset passive. And you could always also just include a fan just in case the heatsink doesn't work out that well. Right? Like the thing is just like if the fan never spins up in the first place, that's better. If there's a worst case scenario, the fan does have to spin up. You know, that's just like I'd consider the fan at that point more of like a safety insurance feature, like an insurance feature rather than an actual cooling, like required cooling element. Right? Because I think a lot of people are basically concerned of like what happens to my chipset if the fan dies. Well, if you never needed if the fan never spun up in the first place because you already have enough surface area to start with under, say, 99% of operating conditions, that would, I think, be the ideal solution. So yeah. Anyway, so that's basically it. Boards should have a chipset heatsink that basically is in this area. And yeah, I guess thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any. Actually, Yeah, end of video. Just like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon, Teespring. You can Patreon, or you can just support me directly monthly. And Teespring, if you'd like to buy some like AHOC themed merch, like shirts, stickers, posters, that kind of thing, you can find a link to that down in the description below as well. Both of those help out with running the channel immensely. So yeah, thank you for watching, and goodbye.